We have a little bit of business to take care of here this morning. A couple weeks ago, actually almost a month ago, we had a special business meeting to confer. Go ahead and stand, brother. Yeah. If I got to stand, you got to stand. Start getting used to it. To talk about Tim becoming a minister, a music minister, to proclaim the gospel message through music. And the deacons and I sat and we asked Tim some questions to license Tim. And so we were going to present it one week, but he was out of town, and then the next week was Easter, and then last week we had a bunch of baptisms. And so this week I'd like to present Tim his certificate of license from Skyline Baptist Church and from all of us. Baptisms, new ministers, these are all signs of a good and healthy church. So may the Lord continue to add to us accordingly. We are in the book of Galatians, still in chapter 1. I know that it says that we're going to go to 2:10. I have a theory that I don't like breaking the train of thought of a text because it's kind of hard to recapture from week to week. But that train of thought was a bit long. And so I figured in the instance of time and purpose that I would split them at a good hard break and then do the thought this morning and pick it up again next week, because I think we can accommodate that on a hard break. So your bulletin says that we'll be going through 2:10 when actually we will be stopping right at chapter 2. So that's why that's there. Okay? So let's pick up Galatians chapter 1, starting in verse 13. Actually, let's back up to verses 11 and 12, because they play a role in here as they played a little bit of a role last week. For I will have you know, brethren, that the gospel that was preached by me was not man's gospel. For I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through revelation of Jesus Christ. For you have heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age and among my people. So extremely zealous was I for my father's tradition. But when he who had set me apart before I was born, and who called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me, or in me, depending on your translation, in order that I might preach him amongst the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with anyone, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went away into Arabia and returned again to Damascus. Then after 3 years I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas and remained with him 15 days, but I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. In what I am writing to you before God, I do not lie. And when I went into the regions of Syria and Cilicia, and I was still unknown in person to the churches of Judea that are in Christ, they were only were they hearing it said, "He who used to persecute us is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy." And they glorified God because of me. Let me pick up here. If you remember from last week, in verse 1 of chapter 1, Paul begins asserting his apostolic authority. I, Paul, do not receive or preach a gospel that I have received by the agency of man nor through man. I am not an apostle by the agency of man or through man, but I am an apostle through the agency of Jesus Christ. And we kind of talked about what it means to be an apostle. An apostle is an ambassador. He is a man who speaks with authority from the one who sent him. And that's the Greek translation for apostle, is a sent one to speak authoritatively on an issue or for the individual that he is sent by. And the implication of when Paul writes here in the book of Galatians, it is not simply Paul writing down. I mean, I could claim the mantle of an apostle, but I don't think you're going to be waiting for the book of Ashley to be rolling out lately. A lot of changes will be made, I guarantee it. I always say when I become emperor, things will be different. And it's a joke, but Paul's authority isn't something that is invested in him. Paul's authority isn't something that he gets from other men. Paul's authority to speak authoritatively comes through the power of Jesus Christ. He is Christ's apostle. And now we're going to look at where he gets this message. Remember, we saw last week that he's telling them that there is a message that he has preached, and if someone comes to countermand that message, let them be accursed. And we pick up here, as we closed out last week, with that the message that I preached was not man's gospel. For I did not receive it by any man nor taught it. I received it through revelation of Jesus Christ. Now, Paul's going to tell us how this revelation kind of comes about. And the accusation against Paul, the reason why he so vehemently defends his apostolic authority, is the accusation against Paul is that Paul has mixed some weird religion with Judaism. That he's come up with some weird religion, and that the real goal is that he is supposed to maintain the rules of Judaism with the concept of faith. That Paul has messed up. He is teaching what we would call antinomianism, and that's a fancy word for basically saying no law. That Paul is essentially saying that there is no law for you to follow, therefore you can live however you want. Now, if we go on and read the other epistles of Paul, we see that that is not what Paul writes. It's incongruent with Paul's message. What Paul is telling us is that salvation we have is not something that we get because of something we do. The work that saves us is not ours, it's the work of Christ. And we'll get into this more as we go into chapter 2 and 3. Now, where is the authority for Paul to say this? Notice that he makes the point, hey, this isn't from men. I don't preach this because I was hanging around and heard someone and thought it was a good idea. I wasn't watching some dude on TV and said, I like this point, I think I'll put it in my sermon. But I received it through revelation of Jesus Christ. For you have heard of my former life in Judaism. Pick up in verse 13. How I persecuted the church more violently and tried to destroy it. I have a question. Is anybody in here hot besides me? So it's just me. And we'll rock on that way. For you have heard of my former life in Judaism and how I persecuted the church violently and tried to destroy it. You have all heard of my past. If I was trying to do certain things or drift away from teachings that I used to have, you know me. And you know that I once tried to destroy this very thing that I'm teaching. Now notice, if you go and you look in Acts, starting around chapter 7, verse 54, you see where Paul begins to persecute the church. He is there in Acts chapter 7 at the stoning of Stephen. They take and they lay their robes at a young man whose name is Saul. That's Paul. God changes his name. And so here he is at the stoning of Stephen. And then in chapter 8, verse 1, Paul is then sent to persecute the church in Jerusalem. And it says, he took men and women and dragged them from their homes and sent men and women into prisons, basically indicating that he sent them in separate prisons to persecute the church, to cause a problem for the church, to destroy them. Actually, the phraseology is violently, to absolutely try to destroy, to devastate, to violently make destitute. That was Paul's mission. If I was teaching this weird doctrine, this is the doctrine I tried to eradicate, and now I proclaim it freely. Why would I put my neck in a noose knowing the consequences of this action if this was simply just a man's doctrine? Let's continue on what else he talks about himself. I was advancing in Judaism beyond many among my own age, among my own people. I was a trailblazer. That's really what he's writing. I was a trailblazer. I was a pace setter. I was the bright, shining star in a pool of a bunch of duds. I was, to use a cowboy illustration, sorry, not Romo, I was the Troy Aikman of the Dallas Cowboys. The Roger Staubach, the guy that stood out as far as quarterback history goes. I am the quintessential young man that you look and go, wow, that's the man we want running the show in about 5 years. He's the guy. He is the heir apparent. Now, why is this? He studies with a man named Gamaliel, and Gamaliel was a very brilliant scholar, wrote volumes of ancient work. We can go back and read those if you want. I'm not going to get off into that tangent. But Gamaliel in Acts has some of the greatest advice that I think Christians should take advantage of. Gamaliel looks, and they have Peter and John, and they're thinking about turning them over to the Roman authorities and stoning them. And Gamaliel says, hey, look, if what they preach is of God, we will be standing in opposition to it. So the best thing to do is to not be in opposition to it, but let them go. If this is not of God, it will die on the vine. And he says, there have been other men that claim that they are the Messiah, and they have died. And the disciples have scattered. If this is of God, it will grow. And if it's of God and we're standing in the way of it, then we bring judgment upon ourselves. That's pretty good advice. He studies with this man, and he learns, and he is grown, and he is caught the eye of everyone. And so he makes it quite clear. People go, well, it sounds like he's bragging here. Well, not really. He's making the point of his tradition and how ardently, because to be exceedingly above his peers, how ardently he held to the rules. These guys held fervently to rules. These guys held to all the Old Testament rules. And that's how you demonstrated how holy you were, how good you were, how great of a Jew you are. How do you prove that? Well, by the rules, right? You can always tell who the great guy is. He is following all the expectations of everyone. This was my former life. I persecuted the doctrine of grace, and I observed all the rules. And I observed them zealously to the point that I hunted down those who preached the doctrines of grace. That was my former life in Judaism. That was the life that I had. So if the laws worked, then why would I convert to this? Verse 15. But when he who had set me apart before I was born, and who called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me, in order that I might preach his message amongst the Gentiles. Let's stop right there. You have a lot going on there. When he who set me apart before I was in my mother's born. The phraseology there is actually when he who set me apart before I was, or while I was in my mother's womb. Paul is being selected before Paul is born for this message, for this purpose. It's the same phraseology that you'll go over to go Acts chapter 9, and it will say, I will show Paul, or Paul is a chosen vessel of mine, and he will take my message amongst the Gentiles. I've chosen him for a reason. I've chosen him for a task. This choosing happened long before Paul was ever an adult. It occurred within the womb, and I will demonstrate to Paul what he will suffer for my name's sake. Folks, we all have a task and purpose within life. Christ has chosen us for a specific task and purpose. Some of it is to be a good parent and a godly parent and bring to salvation the kids that you have brought into this world, and be a good church man and or woman and be actively involved in the pursuit of Him. Others, it is to be called, as Tim is, to be a minister of the gospel message through music. Others, as I am, to be a minister of the gospel through the preaching of the Word. There is a task and purpose for each and every one of us. And that task and purpose begins long before we ever took our first breath. who called me by his grace. Now this goes back to the means by which salvation comes. Is it means of salvation through my work or through the work of Christ? It is the works of Christ that save man, not the works of man. He uses by grace. What is grace? Grace is unmerited favor, which means it's something someone gives to you even though you do not deserve it. I, Paul, persecuted the church violently. I sought violently a means to eradicate it. I intentionally took men and women from their homes and threw them in jail and took their kids and so more than likely either sold them off or sent them off somewhere else. I then received orders to go to Damascus to do the exact same thing. And yet, God showed to Paul unmerited favor, grace. He does not look upon, well, there's a good go-getter. Man, he's out putting people in jail for the name of me. Paul is fighting against the actions of God. In chapter 7 and 8 and early part of 9 in Acts. And he says, who demonstrates his grace, who demonstrated to me unmerited favor to where I shifted from being an enemy of Christ to a follower of Christ to being an ambassador of Christ. My message that I preach to the Gentiles is not something I've concocted within my mind because I used to be a hostile combatant against the things of God. And yet Christ shows me unmerited favor. Christ shows you and I unmerited favor because, folks, here's the thing. If our salvation depends upon what we do, we're all going to hell. There ain't a one of us that's a good, godly person that God's going to go, well, there's a good one. The rest of y'all not going to bed without your dessert. It's not how it works. It is God's unmerited favor. It's Christ's unmerited favor to Paul that changes Paul. Notice on the road to Damascus, he knocks Paul off a horse and he says, Paul, or actually Saul, why do you what? Persecute me. Now who is he actually throwing in jail? Men and women. But notice the correlation. Jesus said, look, when you throw them in jail, you are persecuting whom? Me. And Paul's response is, who art thou? Bright light? Who art thou, Lord? See, Paul's conversion is based upon the grace of Christ. Our conversion is based upon the grace of Christ. It is something that he does for us because here's the thing, nothing that we do is good enough. All of our righteousness, as Paul will tell us, is as filthy rags. The best you can do is a filthy rag. See how wonderful it is that Paul is brought over into this side by the work of Christ. Notice that in his former life, he was outshining others. He was of the exemplar nature. He persecuted the church. But was pleased to reveal his Son to me in order. Task and purpose. What is the purpose of Christ revealing, or God revealing the Son to Paul? In order that I might preach him amongst Gentiles. Acts chapter 9:15 says basically the same thing. Paul is a chosen vessel of mine, and he will be utilized to preach the message unto the Gentiles. I have selected Paul before he was born to do this task. And so Paul's authority for his message is not something that Paul thought about, but is something which God had picked him to do, empowered him to do, and then sent him to do it. Which is why he has the authority to look in the gospel message and say, I, Paul, write this. If anyone tells you a gospel message counter to what I've preached, let them be eternally condemned and damned to hell. And that's what he says. He says it twice, as we saw last week. Where does that authority come from? That authority comes from the one who chose him and revealed himself through him and gave him the power and the authority to represent him as an apostle. Let's continue on. I did not immediately consult with anyone. Notice this phraseology keeps coming up. It is not man's gospel. I didn't get this from a man. I'm not sent by a man. I'm not sent through the agency of man. I did not consult with anyone, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me. So as a lot of the Judaizers would claim, Paul has gotten this message from someone else, and he's gotten confused. Paul, this faith thing is important, but there has to be works involved. See, the faith thing is good. Yeah, it's great to believe that Jesus died on the cross. It's great to believe that Jesus died for your sin. But there has to be an element in which I work or obtain it by a work. And he was taught this by individuals, and he clearly has perverted it. Maybe he went to Jerusalem and learned by the 12, and he, in his zeal, has forgotten it. And Paul makes the assertion, I did not be taught this by any man, nor did I go to Jerusalem and visit with the 12. There's no need for me to go to see the 12. Why? Because then that would be through the agency of what? A man. I speak authoritatively because it's been revealed to me through Jesus Christ. I speak authoritatively because I've been called by the Lord Jesus Christ, by which He was pleased to reveal Himself to me. That's the authority of why I speak, not because some man put his stamp upon me. But I went away into Arabia and returned again to Damascus. Now, what does this mean? The basic answer is the belief is that Paul is assuming that they are aware that when he goes into Arabia for a sojourn, to where he goes and he studies with directly the Son of Man. He leaves Damascus, he goes into Arabia. Now, he's not going into Saudi Arabia. He's not going down into the Negev, which is down in lower Israel. He's going out into the wilderness area around Damascus, into the part that's ruled by another king that is not part of the Roman Empire. He's gone out into that region, and then after a certain period of time, he returns. Now, we believe that it's 3 years. Why? Because in the next verse, he says, after 3 years, I went up to. And so we kind of try to make that fit. But we don't know how long he was in Arabia. And we don't know how long he was there studying at the hands of God. So his message comes to him through this sojourn in Arabia. He didn't go to Jerusalem and learn it. He didn't go to another man and learn it. He went out in Arabia and studied and contemplated with Christ. And many scholars believe that is where he was taught this message. And then he comes back to Damascus. And he's preached it here. Then after 3 years, I went to Jerusalem, and I visited with Cephas, another name for Peter, and remained with him 15 days. But I saw none of the other apostles except James. Now, why is this? Because they're going to say, hey, look, he went down to Jerusalem. He had to have studied with them. I was there for 15 days. I saw Peter, and I saw James, the brother of Jesus. That's it. And I'm not lying because I do not lie. I have not come and learned something and perverted the gospel message. I have not learned it through the agency of men. I have not learned it from the disciples and then perverted that. I was taught it directly, and then I went down to Jerusalem to make myself known to Peter and James, the Lord's brother. Spent 15 days with them. We didn't discuss theology. We didn't talk about anything. Chapter 2 discusses what they talked about, but not here. I went down and saw them. And then I went into Syria. I was still unknown. In Sicily, and I was still unknown in person by the churches of Judea. They knew him by reputation, as we will see. They know him by reputation. but they do not know him by sight. But notice how the reputation has changed. He who once hunted the church, he who once persecuted the church, he who once sought the destruction of the church is now what? Is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy. And he glorified God because of me. This is Paul's authority for why he is an apostle. In chapter 2, we'll pick up as we see where he is validated in the authority. And it's a very basic message. It's a message that is hard for our culture to get its head around. It's hard for most people to get their head around. I don't work for this thing. We've all talked to you, or at least some of you may know about my understanding of gift giving. For those of you who are new, this will be enlightening. For those of you who have been here for a while, this will be a repeat. But that's okay. Repeat is good for instruction. When you say, I would like to give you a gift, I will go, thank you. Do not expect a return gift. That's not a gift. That's an exchange of gifts. You see the difference in the terminology? I would like to give you a gift. Well, thank you. I appreciate gifts. Thank you very much. Now, if you would like for me to exchange gifts with you, say, hey, I would like to exchange gifts with you. Okay, it's not Christmas, but sure, I'll play. Rock on. Why is that? When we hear the word gift, we feel that we are obligated to give something back. That's not a gift. It's not. When we got to give something back, it's an exchange. I get this by giving this. And we take that concept into the realm of salvation. When God says, I give you this gift freely, we go, yes, but I've got to give something back. No, you have nothing of value. It's like a kid bringing... I used to remember I made some of the tackiest stuff for my mom and dad as a kid, and I thought it was gorgeous. And my mom, God bless her, she would wear it to church because my kid made it. But now that I'm an adult, I look at it and go, whoa. Gee, I'm really sorry, Mom, I made you go through that. That was a gift. And the best that it was junk jewelry. No, I was proud of it. And she was proud that I made it, but was it something she would wear normally? No. I used to buy the smelliest perfume there was, and she would wear it, in spite of the fact that it wasn't her favorite perfume. See, we think that we're doing these great things, and God looks at it and goes, it's filthy rags. Why? Because we have built into our culture that a gift requires a response of a gift. Therefore, the free gift of salvation by faith alone requires a work to maintain it, a work to obtain it, and a work to sustain it. And Paul is saying none of those things obtain, sustain, or maintain. It is by the works of Christ alone. What happens is when we come to this concept, the world adopts three positions. Universalism, legalism, and sacerdotalism. In universalism, I get to go to heaven because I am dead. God died for everyone. And I go, if you were to ask an individual, why should God let you into His kingdom? The universalist will say, because I'm dead. Because Christ has died for all man. And goes to those verses and points those out. Kind of misses those other ones that talk about accepting, receiving. Here in this passage, Christ choosing of individuals. Kind of pushes those away. Christ died for everyone. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son. Whoever believes in Him shall not perish and have everlasting life. Well, I believe in there's a God. You get to go to heaven. Bing! It's universalism. So I get to go to heaven because everyone goes to heaven, and we have movies about it. All dogs go to heaven. I have to destroy you. Dogs don't go to heaven. They don't possess a soul. Will there be your dog in heaven? Well, I don't know, but I don't see it in the text, so my answer would be no. That's universalism. So that's one of the ways we approach salvation by faith alone is, well, then everybody gets it. The problem is it runs counter to the text. Then we go to legalism, which is really what the Judaizer controversy is, which is really what you see in certain versions of Anglicanism and certain versions of Lutheranism and within Catholicism and within the Messianic Jewish world and even folks within certain realms of Baptist life. Because we take the rules and we supplant the text with them. And so what legalism says, I go to heaven because I've checked all the blocks. This is what the rich young ruler says to Jesus. I have kept all the laws since I was a kid. And Jesus says, oh really? Let's go with the first one. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Go and sell all that you have and give it to the poor. And he walks away what? Sad. Why? Because his possessions were worth more than his relationship with God. He violated the first rule. Violated the first command right off the bat. So did he keep them from his young age? No! But he kept the rules. He checked the block. He went to church. He didn't date girls that smoked, dipped, chewed, and played games with cards in it and dice. Check that block. See, legalism is a means of obtaining grace because we check the block. We're good because I followed the rules. I've checked the block, I've checked the block, I've checked the block, I've checked the block. And Paul is saying here, you can check all the blocks you want. It's not by the works that you do. It's by the grace of God. So this faith plus works equals salvation is a bad equation. It's faith alone that equals salvation by the grace of God, unmerited favor to us alone, by the works of Christ alone. Now, does that mean that we don't do good works? Paul will tell you that's nuts. James tells us our faith should be a working faith. So before people go, well, I don't have to do anything once I'm a Christian, that's an insurance policy. The last one is sacerdotalism. See, what is sacerdotalism? Sacerdotalism basically means some type of sacrament. Within Catholicism, I believe there are 7 sacraments. I will not go through them, but the main ones that we share is, well, we don't really share them, but we share the name, is baptism and the Lord's Supper, because they sprinkle, and then in baptism, they believe that the blood and bread become the body of Jesus Christ, whereas Baptists and most Protestant believes that it's symbology. But sacerdotalism, I have taken First Communion. I have taken baptism. I have been baptized. And you'll hear this amongst a lot of folks, even in Protestant circles, who come up in a different tradition, primarily more of your Methodist and your Presbyterian. I was baptized at an early age. I'm going to heaven. That baptism does nothing but get you wet. Because the baptism did not change the inner man. You walked away sopping wet. Big deal. Folks, there's a lot of waterlogged Baptists too, before we get too high and mighty. I've baptized a lot of people, sometimes more than once, because they, oh no, this time I mean it. And you sit down and you talk to, yep. See, because it's based upon how they feel, not by what they know. Sacerdotalism. I have come down, and this is how it's done in Baptist churches and most Protestant. I walked the aisle. That's a form of a sacrament. I said a prayer. I went to camp, and we all came down together. None of that saves you. Those are examples or expressions of your salvation. Don't get me wrong. Saying the sinner's prayer, expressing that what your state is and who saves you, that's an important step because it is an expression of who is your Savior. But saying the prayer doesn't change your status. It's the work of Christ that changes your status. You're saying the prayer is an admission of that or an exemplification of that status. And for some folks, and we've seen them, they've said a prayer, but there has been no change within the inner side of the man. It's just sacerdotalism. Those are 3 responses when we come to salvation by faith alone. Here's the thing, and this is the cry of the Reformation. Salvation comes by the work of Christ alone upon the cross. His death, His blood, His being buried and rising again guarantees for us salvation. It is through His blood we are saved, not through ours. It is by grace alone. It's what Paul has just said here in this text. Unmerited favor to you and I because we don't deserve it. By faith alone, not by any works. Paul's apostolic authority is based because he was taught this by Jesus Christ and has taught this to the church in Galatia and has learned this and taught it in Damascus long before the Judaizers began to stir up trouble. It is not by the works we do. Are there works in salvation? Absolutely. Are there things that we need to do as a believer for works? Absolutely. But do not confuse that the fact that we work makes us saved. We are saved, and works are an expression of our salvation. You might be here today. So, I've never heard this that way. I've always believed that I had to do something for my salvation. I believed that it was an exchange. Folks, the opportunity is before you today as the praise band comes to sing. If you would like to know about salvation through Jesus Christ, by the work of Christ alone, I'll be up here at the front. I'll have my microphone turned off. It'll be a conversation between me, you, and the Lord. You say, I've been coming here for a while. I have enjoyed being part of the congregation, but I am not a full member of the body. And I'd like to do so. Today is an opportunity for you to do so today. As the praise band comes to sing, I invite you to come and make your expression known to the Lord.